Well, there is a subject that I don't talk about too often, and you've been here a long time, so you'll probably be able to pick it up better than most, and therefore probably a good thing to talk about when I don't have to start from the very beginning. Rav Dessler has an essay on Musar. Now, Musar, everybody understands, means moral self-improvement or ethical self-improvement, conquering your bad habits, and so on and so on. But Dessler has a very unique approach. He says that the goal of Musar is to reach the truth. The goal of Musar is to reach the truth. And he says this because there are certain enemies of objectivity. If I'm investigating something and I want to trust the evidence that I find and my reasoning power and my powers of evaluation, I have to think that I'm objective. We all know people, other people, who are dreadfully subjective, and they draw all sorts of wrong conclusions from what they see, what they hear, what they experience. Of course, that's only other people. That doesn't apply to me. I, of course, am objective. The question of Dessler raises is, how do you know that? How do you know that you're objective? And it's not just a theoretical question, but there are two great enemies of objectivity to which everyone is subject. One is fairly obvious. People are not objective when the issue the issue that they're addressing involves their desires, what they want, what they get pleasure out of. As he puts it, imagine a person who's investigating whether it's mutter to play chess on Shabbos. Why do you think he's investigating that question? Probably because he wants to play chess. Well, the very fact that he wants to play chess is likely to throw him off in being objective in evaluating the views that he reads, pro and con. He's likely to give much more weight to the views that are pro and much less weight to the views that are con because he wants to play chess. We all know people who smoke and who discount evidence that smoking is bad for you because they can't face the prospect of having to struggle and get rid of the habit. We know people in relationships that are bad for them, and when we try to explain to them how bad the relationship is for them, they go through fantastic contortions to try to avoid your conclusion because they don't want to deal with it. So there's no question that people have limited objectivity. And Rav Dessler points out that every moral failing implies a failure in objective thinking. This is a point which I've never heard made by anybody else. I've been studying and teaching philosophy for decades, and never saw anybody come close to such an understanding. Let's take a few examples. Let's take laziness. Sometimes an investigation of a subject requires strength and persistence. It may take a month or 2 months to go through all the relevant information, and then have to compare it and contrast it and evaluate it. You may have to write to other people and see how they deal with the information. It may be a long and difficult process. A person who's lazy will lose heart somewhere in the middle and just make a preliminary conclusion and accept it because he's too lazy to follow the thing out to the end. That's a failure of objectivity. Laziness means he's going to fail to be fully objective in making his decision. Let's take pride. A person who's proud of his mind, his education, his wisdom, his cleverness. Now he's investigating a matter, and he's coming to his conclusions, and he sees that other people disagree. Can he give adequate weight to other people who disagree? Can he hear them? Can he think, well, gee, I've gone through the material, and it seems to me to be Q, but they're also smart, they're also experienced, they're also knowledgeable, and they come to a different conclusion, maybe I'm wrong. But if he's proud, he's guilty of pride, he doesn't want to admit that they might be smart, they might be well-educated, they might be experienced. He doesn't want to admit that. His pride wants to make him think that he's superior. If so, he can't give adequate weight to other people who disagree with him, and therefore he's not going to have the input from them which would be necessary for him to really be objective in his judgment. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not saying that you make a decision on the basis of majority vote. I said over and over again, adequate weight. There has to be a willingness to take everyone else's opinion seriously with a whole method of critique, which could be applied to decide how much weight to give to another person's opinion. I'll give you an example. You're at a social event, a party, and everyone around you is drinking substantially, and you're not. And there are 36 other people at the party, and all of a sudden, all 36 point to the door and say, "Look out for the pink elephant coming through the door." Now, you're sober, so you know there's no pink elephant coming through the door. Must you give up and say, well, if there are 36 of them, then they must be right? Surely not, because they're drunk. But then what about when you're drunk? If you're going to dismiss their ideas when they're drunk, then the same has to apply to you when you're drunk. That's what I would call giving adequate weight to somebody else's point of view. You can criticize it, you can assess how serious it is or how serious it isn't, but the way you criticize it, the tool to use to assess it should apply to you equally. In that way, you can get the feedback from other people and compare and contrast your view and achieve much greater objectivity. Indeed, in philosophy, they talk about intersubjectivity as a step towards or a substitute for objectivity. If people from different points of view agree on what they see, that's some support for the idea that it's not just my private point of view, just my private prejudice, but they as well agree. But a proud person can't do that. So that being the case, a proud person is going to suffer a failure of objectivity. Whatever moral failing you find, if you play it out in the process of investigation, you'll find that it will imply some kind of failure of objectivity. Rav Dessler, following the Maharal, takes some of his rules or his ideas from the laws of testimony in court. One of the goals of testimony in court, the way in which we accept it, is to make sure that the judge will be as objective as possible. Now, here's a scenario. You're a judge. You're going to hear an argument between two litigants about money or something else, and the hearing is scheduled for 3 o'clock. At 5 to 3, one of the two steps in. At 3 o'clock, you get a call. The other one's caught in traffic. He'll be there at 3:30. So you think, well, only one can speak at a time. I'll let this guy speak, and I'll give him a half hour till the other guy shows up, and then it'll be his turn, and he can speak. What's wrong with that? Jewish law prohibits that. Neither side can speak unless the other side is there, present at the time. But what for? You can't interrupt. You're not allowed to interrupt. Only one can speak at a time. So the answer is, there's a psychological effect. I'm listening to Ruvain talk. I'm a sympathetic person. I identify with people's suffering and sorrows. He's going to tell me a whole tale of woe, that Shimon cheated him and double-crossed him and treated him badly and so forth and so on. If Shimon is sitting there, and while I'm listening to Ruvain, I can see Shimon, what's going on in my psychology is, okay, Ruvain's talking, but Shimon's going to refute him in a minute, and that will hold me back from identifying too much with Ruvain when he talks. But if only Ruvain is there, and Shimon isn't there, I'm much more likely to get sucked into Ruvain's story more than I should. And then when Shimon walks in, he's going to be facing my prejudice. Okay, that's courtroom procedure. Rav Dessler applies that to the following type of situation. I'm investigating something, some issue. It's going to take me about 5 days to look through material and calculate it and evaluate it. On the end of day 2, someone says to me, I understand you're investigating X. How's it going? How does it look so far? That's a trap. Because if I say, well, so far it looks like Q, I've already made a judgment. I've already made an evaluation. I've already given my favoritism to Q. I know there are 3 more days to go. I know that. But in the meantime, I've set myself on Q. The next 3 days of investigation are going to be much harder to take objectively. So as Rav Dessler, you've got to guard yourself against making a preliminary conclusion. Hold yourself back, force yourself not to draw any conclusions at all until you've seen all the evidence, and you can calculate it all together. These are enemies of objectivity. A person who's lazy will find that very difficult to do. Also, if you make a preliminary judgment and you're lazy, when you go through day 3 and 4 of new evidence, to change your mind means to reevaluate all the evidence on days 1 and 2. That's a pain in the neck. And if you're lazy, you're going to be very resistant to doing that. And you're going to fail in your objectivity. So moral failings lead to failures in objectivity. If you want to be objective so you have a better chance of getting at the truth, what can you do? Says Rav Dessler, this is one aspect of Musar. Musar works on your moral weaknesses so as to preserve your objectivity or improve your objectivity. No one's going to talk about perfection. No one's going to talk about being 100% objective. But there are better and worse. There's more or less. And if you work on improving your moral standards and your moral performance, you will thereby improve your objectivity. That's point number 1. Is that clear? Okay. Now Rav Dessler says something a little more subtle. He says, sometimes the purpose of the investigation has built into it a prejudice about the outcome. Not just the investigation happens to impinge on what I want or what I don't want, but the very purpose of it builds in a prejudice. So let's take, for example, I'll give you an example, then I'll go back to the one with chess. I have to get someplace. There are various ways to get there. I can rent a car, go by train, go by plane, go by boat, I can walk, take a bicycle. Well, I want to minimize my financial outlay. I'd like to minimize the amount of time it will take to get there. I'd like to use a means of transportation that's safe. These are things that I want. The decision will definitely impinge on these things that I want. Some ways will get more expensive, less expensive, more safe, less safe. And I have to take them all into consideration. What's pushing me to investigate is, I've got to get there. So I'm looking into ways to get there. There's nothing particularly prejudiced about having to get there and looking for ways to get there. The prejudice will come in because I want money, I want safety, I want to get there in a short time, and so forth and so on. But, and then prejudices like that, or prejudices that come from the outside, like laziness and pride and so forth and so on, I could work to reduce, or even, ideally, work to eliminate. So I become less prejudiced. But in the second kind of case, where the motivation for undertaking the investigation in the first place creates a prejudice, that's much more difficult. If I'm looking up whether you can play chess on Shabbos, that's because I want to play chess on Shabbos. That's why I'm investigating. I can't cut out those types of motivations. Every investigation is undertaken for a purpose. There's something that's pushing me to make the investigation. To avoid the built-in prejudice of the purpose of the investigation would simply be to avoid all investigations. All investigations are motivated by something or other that needs to be done. And when the trigger for the investigation itself creates a prejudice, then you have a problem that can't be opposed by direct Musar, it can't be opposed by improving your morals, because it's built into the very investigation process itself. Here, the only antidote is a commitment to truth. The prejudice is going to be there. It's stuck. There's no way to avoid it. What you have to do is build up, on the other side, a tremendous desire for truth, a tremendous commitment to truth that you can use to hopefully offset the prejudice built into the very nature of the investigation. And Here, although Rav Dessa doesn't say it in these words, but I believe he means it. Let's go back for the third time. This guy's investigating whether or not to play chess on Shabbos. Yes, it's true. He's investigating because he wants to play chess. But he's also investigating because he wants to keep Shabbos. Otherwise, he wouldn't investigate, he'd just play. He has a double agenda. He wants to play and he wants to keep Shabbos. Wanting to keep Shabbos is something which depends upon what Shabbos really is, what the laws really are. It depends upon what's true. Everyone has a built-in desire for the truth. Everyone has a built-in concern for the truth. No one is indifferent to the truth. I'm making a very limited claim here. No one's indifferent. I don't say it controls. I don't say that it always takes precedence. But everybody wants the truth. And the reason is because from very early on, you learn that the truth is very useful. It's very, very useful. Let's see. Which tap is the cold water tap, and which tap is the hot water tap? I know they told me that it's this one and this one, but is what they say true? Can I trust them? Well, if I make a mistake, I'm likely to get burnt. So it's important to know what the truth is. I'm going to kindergarten. Which classroom should I go into? Number 6. Is that true or not? If it isn't true, I'm going to be very embarrassed. Because I'm going to sit down, and the teacher's going to read down the names. My name isn't going to be there, and I'm going to look terrible. I'll be the only one. So I want to know, what's the truth about it? Which classroom is really my classroom, which classroom isn't? Your practical life depends enormously on truth. And it doesn't get any less so when you grow up. Am I going to make it in time for the plane? Well, when is the plane taking off? If I don't have the schedule, I don't know what time, or if I'm mistaken as to what time it is, I could very well miss the plane. And that's a pain in the neck. So I want to know the truth. When is that plane taking off? Has it been delayed? Hasn't it been delayed? The truth is enormously useful. Everybody cares about getting the truth because everybody knows that the truth is enormously useful. It's just that. In addition to caring about the truth, we also care about other things. And sometimes the care of the other things conflicts with my care of the truth, and then I suffer a temptation to skimp on the truth, to play fast and loose with the truth. That's when the temptation is suffered. So at this point, Rav Dessa says, the only solution is to build up your commitment to the truth so that it can counteract the prejudice that's built into the very process of investigation. Now, building up your commitment to the truth, your pursuit of the truth, is a psychological matter and it's a cultural matter. We happen to belong to a culture where truth is very important. It's very important as a value. We have stories that celebrate the greatness of people who pursued the truth and even sacrificed for the truth. And we also have techniques for building a person's commitment to the truth. So, for example, Hillel came from Babylonia to Israel, unknown. Israel, nobody knew him. Came to the yeshiva. They were discussing some difficult issue, back and forth. Finally, Hillel made a suggestion. Of course, his suggestion won the day. At which point, the head of the yeshiva said, well, you're obviously a better scholar than I am. Take over. Another such example from Prague, 250 years ago. Johannes Eibschitz was a businessman. There was a yeshiva in Prague. And one day, the head of the yeshiva, at the end of the day, said to the boys, here's a question. I want you to think about it for tomorrow. Fine. That was the question. On the way home, one of them met Rabbi Eibschitz in the street. Rabbi said, what did you learn in yeshiva today? He said, the yeshiva left us with this question, told him the question. Rabbi thought for a minute, he said, here's an answer. Okay, next day, they come back, and Rosh Yeshiva says, did you think about my question? And the student raises his hand and says, I met Rabbi Eibschitz in the street, and he gave me this answer. So the Rosh Yeshiva thinks about it, thinks, that's a pretty good answer. At which point another boy raised his hand and said, this is very strange, because I also met Rabbi Yonas in the street, and I also asked him the question, and he gave me a different answer. And the second student gives the second answer, and the second answer is also adequate. Well, to make a long story short, every one of the boys brought the next day a different answer to the question from Yonas Eibschitz, and they were all adequate. What did the Rosh Yeshiva do? He resigned. He resigned. He said, Rabbi Yonas is a much better scholar than I am. Let him take over the yeshiva. Now listen, I taught university for 10 years. I know a lot about the university world. Never has anything remotely resembling that happened in the university world. If you have a tenured position, you don't give it up because somebody else is better, somebody else is smarter. You definitely don't do that. And indeed, in my time, the two grand old men at Harvard, Willard Van Orman Quine and Nelson Goodman, had a wonderful student named Saul Kripke. Saul Kripke was a revolving genius, but he had a different way of doing philosophy from theirs. And the question came up whether he should be appointed to the faculty at Harvard, and these two grand old men said, no, what he's doing is not philosophy. Translation, doesn't agree with us. So he went to Princeton and became one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. But that kind of prejudice and that kind of politics is rife in the university world. I could tell you a dozen stories like that. So we have built in, when we tell the stories of these great heroes, what we see is that they had a passion for truth, they were willing to sacrifice for the truth. Now, when you study yeshiva, one of our main institutions for study is the Chavrusa method. Two people are studying together, one reads and explains the text, and the other one shoots him down. It's okay, because tomorrow they're going to switch roles. But that means every time you open your mouth, what's going on in your mind is, what's he going to say? What's he going to say? How's he going to answer? Where's my argument weak? What could be replied? Which means you're developing the attitude of reflexive self-criticism. That's good. That's a way to promote your objectivity. As opposed to university where you write a paper and you want to discuss it with your professor and you make an appointment and 2 weeks later you go in. Here you're getting feedback all the time. And many yeshivas employ people to just be there in the group to answer questions. So if you run up against a problem you can't solve, you go to one of these people, ask him for help, and he gives you help on the spot. You're getting feedback all the time. That definitely promotes objectivity in practice. So when someone is confronted with an investigation for a purpose, and that purpose has a built-in bias, he has a corrective of his commitment to the truth, which can help defend him against the threat to his objectivity. Is it perfect? No, no one's perfectly objective. But the more you are seasoned in this system, the more objective you get to be. And that's how the Musar movement, says Rav Dessler, promotes objectivity, and that in that way helps the person get to the truth. You get it so far? I want to consider one famous objection to this idea. It's an objection to part, and show you that the objection is not valid. Okay, people are subject to distortions, failures of objectivity, but they're idiosyncratic. One person's lazy, another person's proud, another person draws preliminary conclusions. But no fault is universal. Some people have one fault, some people have another fault. Suppose you had a large community of people, hundreds of thousands, scattered all over the world, from different home cultures, different customs, different climates, all studying the same question. And they all came to the same conclusion. Then, the critic says, it would be very hard to put that conclusion down to prejudice or subjectivity. Because not all are lazy, not all are proud, not all are jump to conclusions. And that being the case, if they all come to the same conclusion, the fact that it's a large and varied community means that the prejudices cancel out. And then you have every reason to expect that this is really objective. Not too difficult to figure out what community I'm talking about, right? That's the scientific community. The worldwide scientific community, when they investigate something, by golly, that's objective, because there's so many different scientists of different ages and different climates and different home cultures and the rest, some religious, some not religious, some politically conservative, some politically liberal, radical. You have all different kinds. And if they all come to the same conclusion, then that's got to be objective. Well, I think that's incorrect. I think it's incorrect because there are industry-wide prejudices. in the scientific community, industry-wide prejudices. And they can guide the community as a whole into lack of subjectivity, which will give rise to the accepting certain things as true, which aren't well supported or well founded. One industry-wide prejudice in the scientific community is we are looking for physical solutions for physical problems, material solutions for material problems. This is what's called naturalism. Of course, it has a lot of different formulations and a lot of different explanations, but it's what's called naturalism. Naturalism means I'm looking for something in the natural world that explains what I see in the world. Now, there are two ways to do this. A person could say, it's a free world. There are lots of different things to do. One person is a cobbler, makes shoes. One person is an economist. One person is a chef. What I do is I look for natural solutions. That's what I do. That's just my choice. It's what I like. It's what I'm good at. And I've dedicated my life to that. That's fine. That's fine. It's when the next step comes, and my way of doing it is the only way of doing it. No other way has any purchase at all. The only answers are natural answers. No other answers are reasonable. At that point, he's become an imperialist. At that point, he's become prejudiced. This was called, some people call scientism. Made it into a religion. It just takes over the whole field and wipes out everything else. There's no reason for that. There's absolutely no reason for that. And scientism is an industry-wide tendency. Of course, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, you'll find a few exceptions here and there. But it's an industry-wide tendency, and therefore certain types of solutions to problems won't even be considered because they step outside the naturalistic framework. Well then, you're not going to hear other types of solutions. And I don't necessarily mean supernatural, but what counts as naturalistic in one age is not what counts in another age. Thomas Kuhn, with all of the weakness of his book, Structural Scientific Revolutions, which is a classic, it has weaknesses. And certainly it has weaknesses in the way it's been interpreted and applied. But he documents how difficult it is to make a scientific revolution because people are trained in a certain framework and they tend to interpret everything in terms of that framework, and stepping outside the framework makes them feel dizzy. It makes them feel like they're nowhere. And therefore it requires decades and decades, and very often the revolution takes hold in the younger scientific population. The older scientific population just dies off. They never become convinced that it's right because it's just too disorienting. Now, that being the case, you're going to find that the industry as a whole is subject to failures of objectivity. Here's an example. The whole of the scientific and philosophical world, until 1965, believed that the world has no beginning. The universe has no beginning. It's infinitely old. Einstein, when he created general relativity, was experimenting with his equations to see what they would imply, and discovered that they tolerate the idea that the universe as a whole is unstable. The universe as a whole is unstable. Indeed, it might be growing or shrinking. Growing or shrinking. But then he thought, if it's growing now, then in the past it must have been smaller. And further back in the past it must have been smaller than that. How much smaller can you go? There's a limit to how small you can go. It can't be smaller than zero. So if it really were growing, then in the past it had to be smaller, which would mean it would have to have a beginning. But it can't have a beginning. Having a beginning is unthinkable. The whole of the scientific world for thousands of years has believed that it has no beginning. You look at the stars in the sky and there are no changes. So he rejected it by adding a fudge factor to his equation called the cosmological constant, whose business it was to keep the cosmos constant and not changing. And later, when they discovered the expansion of the universe, he called it his worst mistake. Because he could have predicted it. In 1917, he could have predicted what they found in 1929. that would have made him like God in the scientific world. But he resisted because his mind couldn't take that step. His mind couldn't take the step of taking seriously something which the whole of the scientific world took for granted. This shows you there can be industry-wide prejudices in science, which lock you in. This is certainly true in biology, because the only naturalistic explanation for life, it's not good in those terms either, but the only candidate is evolution. So, if you're committed to finding naturalistic explanations, you want evolution to be true. You're desperate for it to be true. If someone suggests some other possible avenue which isn't built into your naturalistic framework, you are not going to hear it. And you're going to pretend that the weaknesses in the theory aren't really weaknesses, and you can pretend the other guys aren't doing anything that's credible. There's a gigantic amount of that pretense in the present time, because industry-wide, you're committed to there being a naturalistic explanation, and this is the only one in the field. So there definitely can be prejudices that affect the scientific community as a whole, and they will lead to failures of objectivity in the scientific community as a whole. That's an ideological prejudice. There's also a straightforward practical prejudice. Science enjoys gigantic prestige at the present time. Scientists are considered to be the very top of authority in many, many fields, some of them in which they are totally incompetent, some of which they are totally untrained, but they are considered to have that tremendous, tremendous prestige. They want to protect that. They want to protect that. And therefore, they are going to engage in certain types of practices which definitely distort their objectivity, and they also want to protect their economic base. So, for example, suppose you're investigating a certain hypothesis. It's generally understood hypothesis, a good hypothesis, solid hypothesis. And you do some experiments, and you get results that don't really agree with the hypothesis. Now you have two choices. You can try to publish your results. Many journals will reject it because it's the accepted wisdom that the hypothesis is true. And even if some journal does accept it, you'll get a mountain of critique that you did something wrong. And then your mind plays the following trick. There's a term for this called data massage, massaging the data. You think, look, I set up an experiment. No one's experiment is perfect. Probably somewhere in my experimental setup there are certain weaknesses. Maybe the differences that I found between what the theory predicts on the one hand and what I got in the lab is due to the failure of my experimental setup. There's some contaminating influences that I didn't shield out or something else. Wouldn't that be a reasonable way to explain why I got the data that I got? But then, if that's the explanation, the data that I got isn't real data. It isn't real data. It's the result of the failures of my experimental technique. So the real data is the data that would agree with the hypothesis. If I subtract the distortions of my failure of experimental technique, then I would get the data that agrees, so I'll publish the data that agrees, which I didn't get. Because that's the real data that was produced. The only differences were due to the failures. In that way, you can't test anything, because any differences in what you get, you're going to just obliterate. You're not going to publish them, because there's also something that's been picked up on now in the last 5 years, but the very fact that they had to pick it up in the last 5 years means for the last 100 years, it's been a disaster, and that's inability to replicate results. You can't get money to redo somebody else's experiment. Nobody wants to invest in that. Everybody wants to show a return on his invested dollar. And they're investing in scientific research. They're going to invest in getting new results. Well, some people with an agenda decided to redo some of the more important results that had been published, and the results were dreadful. Out of 65 major results, 9 were reproduced, and the rest couldn't be reproduced. Some of these are in medicine, where it affects medical care, and they weren't even attempted to be reproduced because there was no funding for it. So there's a whole movement now to force reproduction, of studies, and that's perhaps a corrective. But you can see how a tremendous prejudice ran through the entire community and led to terrible results. When I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, I had a friend who was teaching at the University of Maryland, teaching computer science. And he said to me, there are many false results in computer science. I said, really? How could that be? He said, it's very simple. To run, those days, 1960, with primitive computers, to run a computer study costs a gigantic amount of money. Somebody gets the money, does the study, publishes false results. How long is it going to be before somebody else redoes the study? It could be 10 years. In the meantime, he's been promoted, he's gotten tenure, he's done other stuff, and it won't hurt him. So it's worth it to him to publish the false material because he's protected by the fact that it won't be checked. So when somebody says that when the scientific community agrees on something, it's very objective because you have such a variety of different people and different backgrounds and different weaknesses and failures, is not entirely correct. There are certainly industry-wide failures, and they will lead to industry-wide lacks of objectivity. And these show up in many, many cases. My white hairs testify to the fact that I'm much older than any of you. I remember some in practical science, let alone theoretical science, but in practical science. When I was a kid, you can read about this on the internet, in the History Channel. When I was a kid, you went to buy a new pair of shoes. There was a machine called a fluoroscope. You put on the new shoes, you stuck your feet in slots in this machine, you pressed a button, and you could see your bones in the shoe to make sure you had a good fit. They x-ray your feet to check your shoe fit. We don't do that anymore. Can you guess why? Because we discovered that x-rays aren't so good for you. But they didn't know that then. They just went along with it because of the latest technology. Some people have what's called birthmarks. The skin is very rough and bulging in certain ways. Usually it's strawberry red, and they're very unsightful. At that time, the standard treatment was radiation. Just burn it out with radiation. And the newest stuff, and it's cutting edge science and everything else. The idea that you might injure other organs of the body when you do that, no one had a clue. One of my relatives had that done and had damage to her thyroid. They didn't know that at the time, but it hurt her. I remember the invention of margarine. Margarine was going to save the world because it's plant fat. It's not animal fat. Animal fat will clog your arteries. This is from plants. What could be better than something from plants? Trans fats hadn't been dreamt of. For 30 years, they were selling margarine on the ground that it comes from plants. 30-year studies show that using margarine is not any more healthy than butter, and maybe butter is a little more healthy. One of the reasons is nobody dreamt of trans fats. So here you have a rush to a conclusion, especially if you can market it, and without adequate experience, without adequate testing, and that goes on all the time. I don't know, it's probably still too far in the past. Maybe 10 years ago, psychologists began talking about A-type and B-type personalities. A-type are very energetic and multitasking and irritable and aggressive and focused. And B-type are relaxed and contemplative and more attracted to aesthetics and so forth and so on. And they told you, statistics show that A-type personalities have a much higher rate of heart attack. So there were training institutes set up for A-types to try to make them more like B-types so they should have less heart attacks. It was just a statistical fluke. They just did the statistics wrong. About 5 years later, they redid the statistics and they discovered that it was a mistake. Sometimes they catch the mistakes fairly quickly, and sometimes they don't. With margarine, it took 30 years. So the idea that because a lot of different people are investigated, they all come to the same conclusion, and they are different people, does not mean that you are going to have super objectivity. It might cancel out failures of objectivity due to laziness. But with a desire for fame, when I was teaching at Hopkins, we had a fellow in the physics department who discovered a particle. It's pretty easy. There may be infinity of particles, so you're not going to run out. You just need more and more energy, that's all. And the student newspaper interviewed him for his views on religion. Why would you interview a physicist for his views on religion? Because you're a physicist. Physicist means super smart, super objective, super creative, super rational, superhuman. So then you want to know his views on everything. That's, of course, ridiculous. Someone in the philosophy department cut out this interview, put it up on the bulletin board with the caption, "See how many mistakes you can find in this." It was primitive. It was childish. But science, having that prestige, wants to protect it. The one that hurts most to me is that when scientists talk about philosophy of science. I'm a philosopher. I know something about philosophy of science. And when scientists talk about philosophy of science, they make the most ridiculous remarks, the most simplistic, ridiculous remarks. Many scientists will tell you that theories must be beautiful. It's a criterion that scientists use. If it isn't beautiful, don't investigate it, don't pay attention to it. We're not accepting it. Now, what is beauty? Not one of them has a clue. Not one of them can tell you what's meant by beauty. But why should beauty be relevant? Could it be that the universe is fine-tuned to my aesthetics? Is that why? Now one of them has a clue. Now one of them has a reason to explain it. Philosophy of science talks about this and has something to say about this. Various different ways to try to explain it. So they just, at any rate, when scientists talk about philosophy of science, they're outside their realm. Not every sports athlete, not every outstanding athlete makes a good coach, right? Why not? He's the world's expert on doing it. That's true, but doing it is one thing and teaching it is another thing. They're not the same discipline. I remember when I read some psychology for a while, and I was very disappointed. So I spoke to someone, and he said to me, "You're making a big mistake." Who writes a psychology book? Somebody who's good at doing psychology. Because he has significant rate of helping people want to know what technique he's using. So he writes the book to explain what technique he's using. Doing psychology is one thing. Writing a book about how to do psychology is another thing. He wasn't trained in writing books about how to do. He was trained in doing. And therefore, in the books about how to do, you find definitions that contradict one another and slipshod thinking in terms of organizing and analyzing and so forth and so on. He wasn't trained to do that. Okay, he's the one who's doing it. He knows it from the inside, but he wasn't trained to give an account of what he's doing. He was trained to do it. Those are two different subjects. Those are two different activities. So maybe they're the ones who have to write it, but don't expect that they write it like a philosopher will write it. They weren't trained to be philosophers or logicians. They were trained as psychologists. So when this person told me that, I thought, wow, now I understand why. When I read these things, I'm so frustrated. Because I'm a philosopher, I'm a logician, I want a coherent account, organized definitions, clear arguments, and so forth and so on. And they aren't doing that. They're doing the best they can as psychologists. So you have to be very wary when a person steps outside his area of expertise. I'll make one more comment, and I'm going to quit. In one way or another, I talk all the time about using experts. I think that's the only reasonable thing to do. What happens when a scientific expert expresses his views against religion? Isn't he an expert? Well, let's see. Suppose you're comparing two theories, 2 points of view, 2 strategies, A and B. What expertise would be ideal for evaluating A versus B? Wouldn't it be expertise in both A and B? If you take a person who's expert in A and ask him for his opinion about the relative merits of A and B, he's an expert in one side only. You ask a scientist about the relative merits of science and religion, you're going to get a lot of nonsense because he doesn't know anything about religion. And frankly, by the way, the opposite is also true. Sometimes people who are religious experts are not cautious enough, not careful enough, and they express themselves about science. And they also make terrible errors because they're not trained in science. The people whose expertise is relevant to comparing A and B are people who are trained in both A and B. It's very, very important to remember. The whole band of new atheists, not one was trained in religion. Not one was ever trained in religion. Some were trained in biology, and some were trained in history, and some were trained in journalism, but they were not trained in religion, and they weren't trained in philosophy. So their material against religion is simply speaking outside of the realm in which they are competent, and therefore you get so much nonsense that's presented. At any rate, I think this is a novel view, and you can read it in Rav Dester's writings, Strive for Truth. The idea of Musar being a way to protect your objectivity, so you're more likely to get at the truth. Okay? All right.